And thank you to Cornmarket and yourselves, members of the INMO, for inviting me along to give you a talk on prevention and treatment of compassion fatigue and burnout. So I work with Zevo Health as a psychotherapist and health psychologist, and I have a particular interest in this area because I have seen both of these issues present in clinic quite often in the last year. So I'm hoping that you're really going to take an hour out to listen to this video and to use it as a time for self-reflection, a time to really just gauge yourselves. Where are you in terms of both of these issues at the current time? And obviously, it has been a very, very challenging year for everybody, but particularly for members of your organization. I know many of you have found it a particularly challenging time and have had to be incredibly resourceful. So I'm hoping this video is going to help you kind of have a snapshot on where you are and things that you might need to do, strategies that you might need to adopt at this time in order to bring yourself to a point of balance or a point of homeostasis. Because, you know, a definition of stress, for example, is when the demands exceed our resources to cope. And I think so many of you will agree with that definition, that the demands have been huge because of the pandemic in the last year. So it has been an increased need for developing our resources. So we'll be looking at burnout and we'll be looking at compassion fatigue. So burnout has been defined as a combination of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So we'll look at the symptoms of burnout, the causes of burnout, and then we'll look at the symptoms of compassion fatigue and the causes of compassion fatigue. And then we'll do a brief comparison between them, because there is a distinct difference, because burnout can happen in any profession. It's not just specific to healthcare. And compassion fatigue is more specific to people working in the front line and people working as healthcare providers. And you can have burnout and not have any compassion fatigue, whereas often with compassion fatigue, very often there will be an element of burnout with that. So that just gives you an idea of the difference. And we'll also look at 20 strategies that you might find really helpful to put in place at this time, or even just take a couple of them that might be useful for you and your physiology. I want to look briefly at what good psychological well-being is, and I want to talk about the term radical self-care. And the reason I've used the term radical there is our mental health organizations and our government have been absolutely brilliant in directing us all towards self-care in this last year, whether that be in the form of stress management, eating well, getting good sleep, exercising, making sure we stay connected in with friends and family despite restrictions. And all of that information has been so useful. But if you are working as a nurse or a midwife, it may be that your self-care needs even more weight or attention than somebody else because of the demands of your profession. So that's why I use the term radical self-care, and we'll look at that in more detail. And also then we look at the literature around the development of resilience, which is always very interesting. So look at the symptoms of burnout first. Emotional: exhaustion, feelings of helplessness, anxiety and overwhelm, feelings of cynicism or resentment, and feeling you have nothing else to give, that the sponge has been thoroughly wrung out. Also, poor job satisfaction can be a symptom of burnout. Maybe you once thoroughly enjoyed your profession and recently you have found that it's been very challenging and you don't get the same level of satisfaction as you would in previous times, remembering that this will all come back. And also lack of feeling of personal accomplishment. And physical symptoms of burnout: you could be feeling really tired, you might be getting headaches or musculoskeletal pain. In clinic, I have noticed quite a few people coming in with their jaws sore because maybe they have bruxism, or they're grinding their teeth at night time, or clenching their jaws, or they're presenting with shoulder pain, neck pain, lower back pain. And all of these can be associated with burnout, increased infections, and definitely we're seeing digestive complaints. I've had clients coming in who maybe they had IBS years ago and the IBS has come back, or maybe they've had a little bit of gastrointestinal reflux and that has come back, and they've had to go on maybe medicines for that. So there's certainly a physical side to burnout. And then behavioral, reduced productivity. Social withdrawal, and I really highlight that one because if we're burnt out, and particularly if our mood has got low, we can have a tendency just to withdraw and to pull away. And of course, people resource us and connections help us so much. So when we pull back and withdraw in order to kind of replenish ourselves, it can sometimes be a negative. And irritability with family and friends, emotional eating or overuse of alcohol. And obviously this can happen in any profession where you find you want to numb out a little bit. So maybe you're craving carbohydrates in a way that you normally would, or you find that you really need that glass of wine late in the evening just to settle yourself down. And these, you know, can happen anybody at any time, and particularly during the year that we have lived through. The causes of burnout, and you will all be so familiar with these causes, but it is good to elucidate them. Demands of the environment, long hours, not being able to take adequate breaks. And that might be because you're somebody who is very conscientious, and you know that if you take a break at that time, that, you know, something might not be done the way you would like it to be done. So it can be, you know, innate in us to not take our breaks, or it can be as a response to the system we're working in. Also, not being able to say no due to the situation we are in, or due to our own internal feelings. Other causes of burnout, or factors that would contribute to burnout, would be things like holding in emotion. I had somebody, a nurse, say to me a while ago, she said, Avril, this probably surprises you. She said, but this thing happened, and she described something that was very upsetting. And she said, I let myself have 2 minutes to process it. And she said, I just had to move on. There was work to be done. But sometimes if we hold in a lot of emotion, that's stressful for us. And, you know, working as a psychologist, I've had this same experience myself, where some evenings I'll find, oh, I feel like I'm holding something in, and we call it somatic carrying. And actually what can be helpful, if you feel that there are emotions there and they haven't been processed, you know, is sometimes you could be aware that they may even not belong to you. They maybe just be a response to something you've seen at work. And I would often see them as like carrying boulders or stones. And I will metaphorically, or I'll visualize myself walking out into the garden and putting all of the stones, all that I'm carrying, out in the garden, and kind of just letting them go. And because this is all a response to traumatic events, and trauma really is just an emotional response to seeing difficult things. And so learning ways of letting go of it is really important. Other contributing factors, wanting to deliver a high standard, or, you know, taking work home, that difficulty disengaging that we just talked about, taking home issues. And of course, you know, because so many patients in hospitals haven't been able to see family or friends, and haven't had any visitors, the nurses will be giving so much and playing many different roles because of the absence of visitors. Another contributory factor will be, you know, we can't do our hobbies the way we normally would. And actually having hobbies is a real protective factor against burnout in any profession. You know, if maybe you're a tennis player, or you're a golfer, or you love hiking in the woods, and you know, many of these things have not been available to us, and that makes us more prone to burnout. No time or space for processing difficult experiences, and no self-care time. So let's look at compassion fatigue. Well, compassion fatigue is the experience of physical and emotional exhaustion. And there's more of an emphasis on the emotional exhaustion with compassion fatigue, and a profound decrease in the ability to empathize. And it's often referred to as the cost of caring for others who are in physical or emotional pain. And there is an emotional residue of exposure from working with those suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. So sometimes compassion fatigue is also called secondary trauma. So what are the symptoms of compassion fatigue? Well, emotionally, depersonalization, feelings of sadness, even feelings of grief. Even though you mightn't be bereaved yourself, you have witnessed maybe loss and grief and bereavement, and it almost feels like you're experiencing it. You can feel irritable, you can have self-doubt, even self-contempt. And that sounds like an odd one to flag, but basically we're more at risk of compassion fatigue if we've had previous experiences of maybe trauma in our lives, or we've had difficult experiences, you know, in childhood or stressful times in adulthood. And sometimes then an inner critic, a negative voice will kick in and we'll say to ourselves, oh, you didn't do that properly, or you should have done much more to help there. Or so we notice that this can happen with compassion fatigue. And of course, it's incredibly important that we practice self-compassion to counteract this kind of self-doubt if it has crept in as a result of compassion fatigue. We can experience lowered mood, anxiety, reduced ability to feel empathy, or constantly feeling emotional. Having that feeling that you can't switch off, that the switch has been tripped and it's in the on position, and that you're feeling a lot of emotions and that it's difficult to switch them off. And also hypersensitivity, something as simple like, you know, you're watching a television program in the evening and there's some violence, or there's some difficult emotional content on the TV program, and you find that you're quite affected by it because you already have a lot of emotions there. Physical could be exhaustion, difficulty sleeping, be a key aspect of compassion fatigue, not being able to switch off, and as we said, similar with the burnout, musculoskeletal pain or digestive symptoms. And then behavioral, you may have poor concentration or changes in beliefs, expectations and assumptions. And with compassion fatigue, sometimes it can trigger a belief or, you know, an assumption where you might feel, oh God, I have to be really good at everything I do, or I mustn't let anybody down, or I mustn't say no. So these are different beliefs that we can carry, that maybe we have a tendency towards them, and then they can be triggered because we get really run down when we have compassion fatigue. You may also find that you're not enjoying work just as much as you normally do, and that you're struggling with a work-life balance. So what are the causes of compassion fatigue? Well, overexposure to patients who've been through trauma, prolonged exposure to trauma material of clients or patients, burnout. And burnout isn't always there in compassion fatigue, but a lot of the time there will be a component of burnout. Also, factors that can contribute to compassion fatigue can be personal characteristics. So someone who feels a lot of empathy, and I have quite a lot of friends and clients who are nurses, and I find so many of them are so empathetic in their nature and are so heart-led in their nature. And unfortunately, sometimes that can make them more vulnerable to compassion fatigue. And also, if you tend to take on lots of responsibility, as a lot of really good practitioners or professionals do, they take ownership of things in order to achieve a really good standard. If you're someone who, you know, seeks to provide a very high standard of care, you can be more prone to compassion fatigue, particularly if you have a tendency towards perfectionism. And I'm always saying to clients, and I've done this with myself, I remind myself, yeah, try and go for excellence, but don't try and go for perfection, because you'll always fall short of your own standards. So, you know, perfectionism can be a double-edged sword. And interestingly, when we look at the research on compassion fatigue, we often find that people who've suffered from it are people who are rated very highly by their colleagues as people who do a really, really good job, and just people who really go the extra mile in their work. So previous exposure to trauma and work-related attitude, you know, we will be looking at resilience later on, and aspects of resilience would be things like learning not to personalize anything, learning to kind of step back and objectify things, and learning sometimes just to, as we said earlier, not try for the highest possible standard in everything, not try for perfection, because these kind of things can trip us up and make us more prone to suffering than if we don't have them. And also those who have a strong tendency towards other directed care giving. And this can be an innate characteristic, personality variable in somebody, that their radar is always open for, well, how can I help in the community or in the hospital or in my family? Or so they're very, you know, their attention is very focused on other people, which of course is such a gift. But again, it can leave them vulnerable to compassion fatigue. And this may be a pattern that's there from childhood. And one of the things we'll be looking at in the 20 tips is learning to switch off that when we need to and take care of the self. So let's look at the difference between burnout and fatigue, and it's mainly fatigue I want to focus on here. Compassion fatigue can be characterized by disengagement, where, you know, you've gone that extra mile, you've been so involved, and then you almost feel disengaged from the work. Your emotions can be blunted, and you can feel helplessness and hopelessness. Whereas if somebody is in the throes of burnout, sometimes they have this sense of urgency or hyperactivity. And also with compassion fatigue, you can lose your ideals, your hope, your motivation, all the reasons that you may have come into a profession like nursing to begin with. Sometimes there is a diminished sense of those ideals and hope. It does come back. And the compassion fatigue can lead to lowered mood and detachment. And where burnout is very much a physical feeling, the primary damage in compassion fatigue is emotional burnout, if you like. And it's highly variable in its onset, in that, you know, with burnout, sometimes you can see that happening somebody over a period of time because their work is so demanding and there hasn't been time off, and they're juggling so many different roles, and maybe they've had no holidays, and maybe there's understaffing, or there can be a whole range of different things going on. And you can often trace back the origin, where it is with compassion fatigue, actually, that can suddenly happen. You can just suddenly have that feeling of overwhelm and wanting to disengage and feeling like you're running out of empathy. So it can develop in a fast or a slow manner, and it's directly related to the nature of work. And it's also directly related to the use of empathy. And we know so many nurses score high on empathy, and it's a fabulous trait. But when we empathize with another human being, we're almost walking in their shoes. We're almost locating in ourselves a feeling of what that person is feeling. So the research is indicating that if we can sometimes move away from empathy to compassion, because many of you will know this instinctively and intellectually, that when you are compassionate, you can objectify, you can take kind of a distance from what you're feeling and be more objective. And that protects you against compassion fatigue. And the good news about compassion fatigue is you can recover quite quickly if you catch it early. Now, excuse me, if there's compassion fatigue with a strong element element of burnout, the chances are that just takes a little bit more time for recovery, and the strategies we discuss are going to be really important. So before we look at the 20 strategies, I want just you to focus here on what we call emotion regulation systems. Okay, so there are 3 primary emotion regulation drivers, if you like. So the first drive is for productivity, being good at what you do, the striving, the the creation of something. It's pursuing and it's achieving, and that is related to hormones or neurotransmitters like dopamine, which are involved in concentration. The second primary driver is threat avoidance, okay, avoidance of threat activation. And this often involves maybe stress chemicals like adrenaline or like cortisol, which, as you all know, cortisol is the chemical that happens if you're constantly under stress. So the avoidance of threat, it can be from an external stressor, like a threat in your environment, for example, a deadline or physical danger or a pandemic, or it can be from an internal threat, a threatening appraisal of yourself. For example, if you've got very worn down and maybe your self-esteem is low, you're not feeling good about yourself, and you're trying to avoid those negative feelings. So it can be from an external stressor or an internal stressor. And then the third main driver is a soothing driver, and that's about knowing how to rebalance ourselves, reassure ourselves, empathize with ourselves, encourage ourselves, and take care of ourselves. And that's more to do with a chemical called oxytocin. Now, the reason why at the moment people are more at risk of burnout and in nursing would be more at risk of compassion fatigue would be the threat that the pandemic has posed. We're using more energy in staying safe. So a lot of our energy is here in the blue and the red, the drive and the avoidance of threat. And actually, we really, really need to spend as much time in self-soothing mode. So if you take nothing else out of this video today, it's how do you self-soothe and mind yourself at that deeper level. So, and remembering that when we are in the avoidance of threat, we can often stimulate the amygdala in the brain, which is where fear is and excess emotion, and move away from the prefrontal cortex, which is problem solving. So we can have this feeling of being in threat activation and having difficulty relaxing. And so in order to avoid burnout and compassion fatigue, or to treat them, that's the first thing we need to do, is to look at those primary drives and to say, okay, I'm going to spend more time in self-soothing, whatever way I can. So let's look at 20 ways. Understanding the emotion regulation system would be the first one. Okay, understanding those 3 primary drives. And then the second one would be understanding heart rate coherence. So a huge part of wellness is being able to regulate autonomic nervous system function. So all of you will be super aware of the system going into the fight or flight with your cortisol and your adrenaline, or the system being able to stay in parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. Now, even before the pandemic started, many people were spending too much time in the fight or flight and too little time in the parasympathetic. And that's also just to do with how we're wired and our childhood experiences and, how our physiology responds to a stressor. But it's incredibly important now for self-care to be able to regulate autonomic nervous system function. And I often use the term heart rate coherence, because when we're balanced, our heart rate variability synchronizes with our breathing. So, you know, as we kind of breathe in, we are going into one part of the nervous system and then taking a long exhalation out. We're moving out of the sympathetic into the parasympathetic, and we're re-regulating our nervous system. And if the heart rate is corresponding with that, and we have good heart rate variability, we can calm our systems down. And ways of calming the systems down, you know, if you're listening to this and you register, oh, sometimes I feel like my heart is beating faster, or that my chest is tight and I can't take a deep breath, and all of these things are happening so many people, not just within the nursing profession, but it's how do we re-regulate autonomic nervous system function. And what's really good to do is to become aware of the physiology, become aware of what's going on, and, you know, check in and feel if your body is tight, and just to soften the muscles and the holding patterns. Where are you holding that tension? And then soothe anywhere in the body that's holding that tension. And then become aware of the emotions that are there. And it could be anxiety, or it could be worry, or it could be anger. And whatever the emotion is, or fear, just to allow those emotions to be there, because when we allow things to be there, they pass. So that is just a way of calming down the nervous system, checking in, softening, soothing, allowing, and then kind of saying, okay, I've identified what the emotions are and I'm going to allow them to be there, but I'm now going to put them to one side. So that's the first tip. The second one is know where you are in your own body mind. You know, everybody has something that their body tells them when they are heading towards overwhelm or burnout. And it could be that your jaw gets really tight, or that suddenly you have a little bit of IBS. Or so, you know, if 10 is really being overwhelmed or feeling burnt out or with compassion fatigue, and 0 is, you know, a point of wellness, score yourself out of 10. Where are you? And, you know your own body mind, so that when you get to a 4 or a 5, I'm getting those symptoms that are telling me that I need more self-care, and come back from that place. You can also self-assess using the ProQual 5, which is a self-score measure, and it measures compassion, satisfaction, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress. It is free there to download. So, you know, it may just be helpful for you to have that tool there so that you can monitor yourself if you need to. The fourth step would be to understand your own nature. Because those who are really concerned with the needs of others sometimes disconnect from their own needs. And I've seen this a lot with amazing people that I work with, both in psychology and nursing, that they're so good at attending to the needs of others, and they lose a connection with their own needs. So, you know, every now and then just tune in, the emotions you're experiencing, the sensations you're having, the thoughts that you might be having, and your behavioral responses. Because if you know, if you have the ability to, that's that sensation, I have that funny knot in my stomach again, or I'm just feeling a little bit low in myself again, and I find that my thoughts are going a little bit towards the negative, not having optimistic thoughts, or if you become aware of these different processes, then we have the freedom to choose our behavioral response. Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, he's a psychiatrist who lived through Auschwitz, and he always says that that's where our true freedom is, how we behaviorally respond to our thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And, you know, if we have choice and if we have freedom then to choose, we might choose things that really help us and build us up, rather than things that maybe could be numbing out activities, for example. Another point would be to set emotional boundaries. And the challenge is, and many of you will know this much better than I will, and will be using this kind of thing every day, but the remaining compassionate and empathetic, but particularly compassionate and supportive of others without actually taking on somebody else's pain. Another key aspect is the development of self-compassion, and this is absolutely key. Do you know how to mind yourself. Self-compassion is really helpful in dealing with compassion fatigue and burnout. It's associated with the development of psychological strengths, of emotional intelligence, of resilience, of optimism, of wisdom and motivation. And I'll talk to you in a moment a little bit more about self-compassion. Yes, here on this slide. Really, you might be someone who treats others with great kindness, understanding and care, but it's making sure that you bring that same quality to dealing with yourself. And extending that non-judgment and that kindness to yourself. So, you know, when we are imperfect, when we fail, when we experience life difficulties, when we get things really wrong, you know, all of these things are inevitable, but we can make them much worse by self-criticism, or by, you know, not letting things go, not forgiving ourselves everything, putting more pressure on ourselves. Brené Brown has written a lot on this, and Kristin Neff, K-R-I-S-T-I-N, Kristin Neff is a lovely TED talk on self-compassion. So when we accept our experiences with empathy, with kindness, and with level-headedness, this is self-compassion. So it's basically a non-judgment towards the self. When we're too hard on ourselves, we trigger the fear part of the brain, which is the amygdala. And this then floods us with anxiety and diminishes our resilience. So we're back into secreting high cortisol levels then. When we're compassionate to the self, we release oxytocin, and this helps us to feel safe. And it also helps us to reach out to other humans, because we know that withdrawal can be a key symptom of compassion fatigue. And when we are really kind to ourselves, so for example, say we make a mistake at something, and we can say, okay, look, you didn't do it brilliantly, it wasn't perfect, but you're going to do it even better the next time. Don't be worrying about it. When we extend that kind of self-compassion to ourselves, we don't secrete cortisol. We can secrete oxytocin, and then that makes us open out to others more, stops this withdrawal that we sometimes can experience. So the key to growing any psychological resource is to have repeated experiences of it that get turned into lasting changes in neural structure or function. Now, the reason I put that in there, and that's kind of a neuropsychology piece, is it's what we do over and over that makes changes in our brains that allows us to access those, you know, that part of the brain more easily. So, for example, if you look at the work on mindfulness, which is a brilliant tool for self-care, we noticed Richard Davidson, this American psychologist, took London taxi drivers and he put them in these like moving MRI machines to see what part of their brain was most active, and discovered that it was part of the brain to do with navigation. And then he put in Buddhist monks and looked at where their brain was most active, and found it was the left side of the prefrontal cortex, and that's associated with emotional balance. So in other words, because the monks have mindfulness practices and do meditation, they had increased connections in a part of the brain that made them feel really resilient and balanced. And the London taxi drivers, because they do so much driving and having to remember maps, their part of the brain that was really busy and had loads of connections was the navigation side. So self-compassion is something we need to practice, and to keep practicing it, to repeat over and over. So number 7 is emotional expression. Some of you may have read Edith Eggers. She's written The Choice and The Gift, both on the bestseller list. She lived through, I think it was Auschwitz. She's a clinical psychologist. But she always says the opposite of depression is expression. So how do you express what the emotions that you need to process? And sometimes we think, well, if you think something through to the bitter end, you've processed it. Not necessarily. Sometimes we need to speak our worries out loud, or the emotions that we're experiencing. We need to actually talk about them in order to process them fully, or to write them down. And I'm a great fan of therapeutic journaling. Some of you might know the Julie Cameron book called The Artist's Way, which is a book about journaling, and I think it's 10 chapters, and each chapter kind of gets you to process different parts of the self. Can be very helpful if you like writing. A great way to process emotions. And you know, it can be with a peer, or it can be a family member, or it can be with a professional. The next is using positive coping strategies. The model I use here is AAABC. So I would often give my clients a picture of a clown juggling all these balls in the air, and in each ball I'll get them to put a stressor, something that is really, you know, they're struggling with at the moment. And then they have to say, now, do I alter, do I avoid, or do I accept? And there are some stressors that we just have to accept. We can't alter them or avoid them. And then B is building resistance. And that's unique to each one of you. What makes you feel strong? And in resilience training, we often get somebody to identify a time in their life where they felt just really positive, resourced, connected to themselves, really enjoying their lives. And we get them to find that part of them within, and to keep reminding themselves of that person. So if we've moved away from a set point of feeling strong and resilient and good about ourselves, locating that person within ourselves, and, you know, connecting in with her can help us feel resilient again. So B is for building resilience, or building resistance to stress. What way can you do that? What works for you? And then C in that model, alter, avoid, accept for the different stressors. And B, building resistance. And C, change cognitions. You know, is there a more helpful way about thinking about this situation? So, for example, I would be a reformed catastrophizer. As a younger woman, I think I was always catastrophizing about things. Oh, this is never going to change, or that's never going to happen, or the situation is always going to be like this. Never and always are words we often use with catastrophizing. But because of all, you know, my training as a psychologist, I learned to be much more optimistic in my thinking. And to this day, that really stands to me. So changing cognitions can be really helpful. Developing hobbies and flow activities. And for many of us, this has made us more vulnerable to compassion fatigue and burnout, because we haven't been able to do our hobbies. But also, sometimes if we're very busy in our lives and we're raising families and juggling the needs of home life and work life, we let go of hobbies. And the research indicates that hobbies are really good for us. They resource us. And particularly hobbies that also dip into what we call flow activities. And a flow activity is an activity that you're so immersed in or so engaged in that all your worries kind of fall away. And this can be singing in a choir, it can be playing a musical instrument, it can be, you know, playing badminton, it can be swimming in the sea. You know, do you have a flow activity? Because it can really help you find that place in yourself where you are truly resilient and truly resourced. So you may not be able to do flow activities yet with restrictions, but in the future, have you a flow activity? And if you don't, could you find one? Flow activities also bring us out of our comfort zone, a little bit into our stretch zone. So, you know, it might be to be a good tennis player and that we have to practice our serving a lot, or, you know, it's challenging us a little bit. Creating friendships outside work. So we know from research that peer-to-peer support is incredible. And, you know, as nurses and midwives, we can resource each other. But it's also important to have friendships outside the work environment, so that sometimes you're leaving work behind and being engaged, you know, outside of the work environment, in other relationships. And the next point is avoiding suppression of emotion. And this can happen so easily when you're nursing, because there isn't the time to have an emotional response, even to something traumatic that you're seeing. You're having to park it. But making sure that when you can, in each week, you're giving yourself some time for processing, whether that is speaking, whether that is through therapeutic journaling, doing something like the Artist's Way, which gets you to do 3 pages of foolscap writing every day. Whatever way it is that you are tapping into emotional content that might be there, and that you're naming the emotions that you're experiencing them, and that you're allowing yourself to feel them, to acknowledge them, and to honor them. And I'm going to actually come back to that point in a minute. Number 12 is development of a routine, a schedule, and brainstorming on work-life balance. Now, this is particularly important as well if you are doing shift work, because work-life balance can be really a challenge, as all of you know, if you're doing shift work. So I would often get my clients on a Sunday evening to look at the week ahead and to say, well, where am I getting my chill out time, my time where I'm not minding anybody else, I'm not minding patients or elderly parents or homeschooling children, or I am just having some time for myself. And it's incredibly important. And even as I say this, I'm conscious that for many of you, you may not have had this because of homeschooling, etc. So, but if you can, put in absolute time out, and then as well, time for activities that you might enjoy. Make sure they're built into the schedule, so that it's not all about work, that it is balanced. And, if necessary, sit down with your partner and, make a list of ways that you can improve your work-life balance, and ways that make sure you are resourced and, can take time out so that you're nourished and can come back into the fray. If necessary, seek personal therapy. And particularly if you're really having difficulty detaching from situations and you find that your empathy feelings are there all the time, and it's difficult for you to objectify or distance, or, there's lots of reasons why therapy can be really helpful. As psychologists, I have to see a therapist from time to time for supervision. And I love being able to offload and bring to my work all of, to my supervision and therapy, all of what I'm experiencing with clients. And this can be really helpful. So it can also help you to uncover any unconscious drives that might be happening. We talked about perfectionism. We talked about unrelenting standards. We talked about wanting to say no and hearing yourself say yes. And sometimes we need help with these different patterns to see where are they coming from in the unconscious mind, and how can we change them. Therapy can be really powerful to affect change. Another tip would be creating rituals. When you are transitioning from your work shift, transitioning out of nursing into home life, do you have a ritual, by taking off your uniform, and do you burn an oil, or do you light a candle, or do you clear some space? Do you do some mindful self-compassion meditation? Do you do some breathing? What rituals do you use to transition? And also, I'm very conscious at the moment that homes are very busy. Might have partners that are working from home, or adult children using the dining room table as a workspace. How do you find a sanctuary? Where can you corral off a space for yourself that is your sanctuary, and a place where you do your breathing or do your meditation? Or, I've one client, she's a nurse, and she says she often comes home and has a little cry for herself in her sanctuary space, let the tears flow, and then says she feels a little bit better about everything. So, that's a ritual that works for her. It could be having an Epsom salts bath. It could be, you know, taking off the uniform and rubbing on some lavender oil before maybe you go for a rest, or just make sure you are doing self-care rituals that use things like, you know, a beautiful environment to be in, burning candles, burning essential oils, doing breathing, doing meditation. Use humor, and I think as Irish people we're brilliant at humor anyway, and even black humor. We manage to find humor in the darkest of times and in the darkest of spaces, and I think that serves us very well, that humor. And practice becoming self-directed as opposed just to other-directed. So we were talking about this earlier on, being other-directed. And what can happen is if you're nursing and then you come home and you're also then, you know, minding family members, either elderly parents or, you know, your own children or a partner. And so you're still other directed, and being able to switch that off, saying, okay, I've just done X number of hours where I'm so focused on other people, and I'm going to switch that off now, and I'm just going to focus on me. Come back into the self, accessing your own emotions, seeing what it is you need to do. One of my trainers used to say, to make the 12-inch journey from the mind and all its thoughts into the heart, and say, what is it that I need now? And I know that sounds like a really simplistic tool, but actually if you try that even 3 or 4 times in a day, just stop what you're doing and come into the body and say, into the heart specifically, what is it that I need now? And you'd be amazed how that actually can be quite a radical diversion from your normal practice, because you're so other directed, and it's really protective and helpful against burnout and compassion fatigue. So in a moment we're going to look at more self-care practices and also the literature around resilience. And then, you know, number 19 is taking time out. And I know it's very difficult to even plan leave and plan holidays at the moment, and we probably won't be traveling. But have you got in your diary time, whether it is, you know, long weekends or going down the country when we're able to do that again in the summertime, please God, what way are you planning your time out? And make sure you have that in the diary, and make sure that every week you have several hours cordoned off in your diary where it is complete time out. And then obviously the 20th and final tip is to constantly be aware of psychoeducation and keeping up to date with wellness and how you can stay well. And stay in that point of balance. And this, you know, even listening to this webinar today, I'm hoping is a good starting point for you. Before we move on to self-care, I just want to look at the acknowledging and accepting of emotions. And I want to call you out a poem that I think is really helpful. So this poem, it's basically, we need to acknowledge the power of naming our emotional states and the power of not pushing down our emotions. If we feel tearful or fearful or angry, allowing those things to be there, then the power of acknowledging and accepting them. And the Sufi poet Rumi said that emotions are like unwanted visitors. Sometimes you'd be running a guest house and you'd see somebody coming down the road to the guest house and you'd be saying, I hope they're not coming to stay here. Really don't want these visitors. And our emotions can be very similar, that we just don't want them. But if you allow those visitors to be there, they will leave in time. And this guest house, some of my patients laminate this and carry it with them in their wallet, because it really says it all. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight, the dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in, and be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. I'm hoping you might find that helpful. You know, good mental health is how we think and feel about ourselves and how we interpret events, and being able to cope with change and transition and significant life events, and being able to bounce back, being resilient, so that we can survive the pain and disappointment and sadness that all of us will have in our lives at some point, and also a belief in ourselves and our own dignity and worth. So, you know, if we have really good psychological well-being, and remembering that at the moment 60% of the population of Ireland say that they don't have the normal enjoyment of life that they would have, and enjoy the normal kind of real feeling of well-being that they would normally have. So it's very normal at the moment not to be okay and not to be feeling good. So, you know, with psychological well-being, key elements would be knowing yourself and accepting yourself, being autonomous, and feeling that you're in control of your environment. And so really knowing, well, I can't control these things, but I can control this. That's very important. Developing positive relationships and having a purpose in life. Nietzsche says that we can withstand any how if we have a why. So knowing, you know, having a purpose, a goal, a vision, can be really helpful to get us through normal everyday life and prevent us from burning out, and also being in a process of growth, and even acknowledging thoughts and emotions and sensations, almost as if we're observing ourselves, and we're curious about ourselves as humans and how we cope with difficult situations, and we remain a little detached from our thought processes. This is all part of psychological well-being. So self-care strategies for burnout and for preventing compassion fatigue and treating it, radical self-care. You know, really scheduling in time for your exercise, for your sleep, for your nutrition, taking up meditation. I am a massive fan of meditation. I used to think, why is everybody talking about it? It can't be as good as people say. And then I had to do a course of it as part of my work, and I found it transformative. It really can be so helpful to take up a form of meditation. PalousMindfulness.com. That's a website from the University of Massachusetts, Palooz Mindfulness, and it's just brilliant in teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction. It takes about half an hour a day to do, and Professor Brendan Kelly in Trinity has written a book on this, actually, called Sitting for a Year, because he built it into his own very, very busy life. And he found as a psychiatrist that it was really, really helpful. That's a lovely book to read, Sitting for a Year. The development of the wise mind, and this is being able to go from the emotional mind and acknowledging our emotions into the problem-solving mind, the prefrontal cortex, and being able to go in and out. This is the wise mind, and meditation helps us to go into the wise mind. And therapeutic journaling, which I've spelt incorrectly there, is another way of making sure we don't get burnt out and minding ourselves. It's part of radical self-care. Now, some people, they don't like writing, but the research is really positive about, you know, opening up your foolscap and putting your pen to paper and not writing it, you know, as a diary in terms of, you know, yesterday we had a picnic, but actually allowing all of the content there that is within to come out onto the page with no judgment. That therapeutic journaling can be really helpful. We've talked a little bit about the role of meditation and how it can increase the connectivity of separate regions of the brain. It helps with integration of the brain. And the most integrated the brain has ever been measured to be is with Tibetan monks doing compassion or loving kindness meditation. But they meditate on compassion, but they also mind themselves with deep compassion. So that's just something to be very aware of. In terms of the literature on resilience, resilience is really interesting. What makes people resilient? Having good self-esteem. So if you're somebody who sometimes really goes into self-doubt, then therapy can be really helpful for undoing the harm done by low self-esteem and self-doubt. And actually, there's a lovely book by Greenberger and Podesky called Mind Over Mood, Mind Over Mood. And it's a cognitive behavioral therapy book. Teaches you to do it for yourself, to catch your negative automatic thoughts, because all of us have 50 to 60,000 thoughts in our head in a day. And some of these thoughts are not rational thoughts, and they often tend to be more negative than positive. And that's called the paper tiger effect. It comes from hunter-gatherer man. We're more likely to survive in those days if we said, oh, there could be a tiger in that wood, so I better be vigilant here, than if we said, oh, I'm sure there's no tiger there, I'm not in danger. So we have a proclivity to have more negative thoughts than positive thoughts. So if you're someone who, finds that your thoughts often betray you, maybe they make you doubt yourself a bit or undermine your confidence and your competencies, using a book like Mind Over Mood or the Feel Good Handbook by David Burns, these teach us to catch our negative automatic thoughts and to put in more helpful thoughts. They train us to be optimistic. Flexibility of thinking. Resilient people are able to move 360 degrees, a flexible mindset. They're good at developing relationships, and that's not a given for everybody. For some people, really connecting in and developing a network is not easy, particularly if somebody is quite shy. But resilience can be increased by identifying a few key people in your life that you really, really trust and working on those relationships. Spiritual freedom. So acknowledging that, there's so many different beliefs and faiths out there. And it's really interesting, the research on people who have some kind of a faith-based practice, be that Judaism or Christianity or Hindu or Buddhist, whatever it is, that actually that really can resource us. And if you look at the Blue Zones, which is a book by Daniel Butner on the civilizations around the world that have the greatest number of centenarians, the Blue Zones, you'll find that a lot of people who live to be very old and very well often believe in something higher. They have a transcendental belief. It can even just be in the power of nature. So that can make us more resilient. Positive coping strategies, learning to regulate our emotions, through the breathing, through exercise. The vagus nerve, as you know, helps us regulate the fight and flight and the rest and digest. And what's really interesting about that vagus nerve is that 80% of it is afferent nerve pathways. In other words, the 80% of the nerve fibers involved in the vagus nerve come from the body back up to the mind. And why that is so relevant is it means our practices, like exercise, like doing some yoga, like doing some breathing, they all regulate the nervous system function by changing, the vagus nerve from the activities that we do. So that is bottom-up regulation, as opposed to, thinking our way out of difficult situation is top-down. So our physical practices of wellness are incredibly important, and no more then mindfulness is really helpful, and moving into a non-judgmental mind. So building resilience is about being able to bounce back, and we feel resilient when we can overcome situations, when we can utilize our strengths and have a degree of mental toughness. And resilience also involves self-regulation. Know how to regulate your physiology, your thoughts and your emotions, how to change your fight or flight response, know how to self-soothe, how to down-regulate your system. And that's going to be different for all of you. But the research, is there in terms of breathing 6 breaths per minute, several times a day, doing that, doing self-compassion, doing mindfulness, doing some yoga stretches, getting our exercise. This is all part of radical self-care and building our resilience. Building our mental agility, perspective taking, being able to see multiple vantage points. And if we are overwhelmed or if we feel some trauma, We can get very stuck. We can go very rigid in our thinking or very chaotic in our thinking. So kind of to be aware of that, again, observing ourselves with a bit of equanimity and curiosity, how we respond to things in our lives, identifying causes and enacting solutions, and using the STOP protocol. And this can be a lovely thing to use at work, particularly if you're feeling overwhelmed, is you stop, you take a breath, you observe just what's going on for you, what's triggered you, what's happening. And then the P is changing your perspective. So stop, take a breath, observe, and change perspective. This can be really helpful. Resilience is also about building your optimism, knowing what you can control and what you can't, seeing challenges as opportunities for growth. That mindset, that switch that we can flip, we say, okay, I won't be undone by this challenge. You know, I will see it as a way to grow in my life. And build self-efficacy, master your environment as much as possible, and know your own strengths. And I find that I often, you know, work with psychologists, psychotherapists, chaplains, nurses, people who I would so admire. And I can see such strengths in them, and they're often not aware of their own strengths. There's a lovely website called valuesinaction.com, and it's a free way of accessing your strengths. It's a little questionnaire. And I think it's really important we know our own strengths, and also that we feed that back to other people. You know, what I love about you is, you know, your kindness or your ability to respond so justly to a situation or whatever it is that you see in somebody, so that we build each other up, building connections, who resources you, and really identifying those people and building them into your life. And spirituality, cultivate an awareness of a bigger picture, connect with nature, spirit, mission, purpose, faith, whatever works for you, and that is highly individualized. So, you know, we've looked there at a lot of different information on how you use self-care, how you develop resilience. We've looked at the signs and symptoms of burnout. We've looked at using the ProQual 5. If you feel some of this might apply to you and you want to see where you are at in terms of burnout or compassion fatigue, and you know, that will give you an idea then of how much time or energy you need to put into bringing yourself back to balance. And I've really, I hope, emphasized the importance of regulation of nervous system function to get back into balance. And that's all the sleep and all the exercise. And sleep, I may not have emphasized that enough, but we will do another webinar separately on sleep, because it's a core. If you're not getting enough sleep, everything else is going to be harder to achieve. But thank you so much for inviting us to come and speak with you. And I hope you have found that helpful. I know there's a lot of information there in a short 1 hour session, but hopefully, you know, you can go back and look at the video several times and look at the 20 tips and say, what of these tips are going to be the ones that are going to work for you? And don't try and make too many changes all at once. We know from stages of change theory that, you know, we can't affect loads of changes all at once, but you might start this week, for example, with practicing self-compassion. If you're somebody who sets incredibly high standards for yourself, next week you might start exploring a mindfulness self-compassion program or mindfulness-based stress reduction like Palou's mindfulness. The following week, you might really focus on your breathing. So build in these different strategies one by one and see how you go. Okay, so thank you so much for spending the time, and I hope all of you will be well and balanced in yourselves. Okay, thank you.